Hello, my name's Michael Burke, and I blog regularly for a blog called Socialist Economic Bulletin. And I want to examine the outcome of the budget that Rachel Reeves delivered, the first Labour budget for over 14 years. Um, and I think it's important to go back to it because it's such a consequential policy initiative. In effect, what we have is a deepening of austerity. And that's not what was billed, at least mainly, although Keir Starmer did say at one point things will get worse before they get better. Um, but there's been some confusion about how the government policy on the budget will affect the economy over the next period. And I think that confusion needs to be cleared up, not least because the budget sets the framework for what's going to be happening for government policy on the economy for the next few years. Rachel Reeves said that in the Commons this week, that it sets the envelope for taxes and for spending over the entirety of this parliament. So it's going to have major consequences for us all. I'm going to share some charts with you, some tables mainly, which are official data, not mine, not created by me, so we can rely on the most authoritative data. Uh, if they are or seem a bit overwhelming, please feel free to ignore them. Or if you're very interested, this post will be put up on the Socialist Economic Bulletin blogspot, and you can examine them at your leisure. So I'm just going to share now with you a quite short series of tables, um, and let's see how. Okay, hopefully that's working. Okay. So the first point to note is that it is an austerity budget, and I'll explain how and why. Prior to the budget, the government made, in my view, rightly, a big focus on growth and investment. The mantras are that you can't have strong public services and strong public finances without a strong economy. I agree. And secondly, you can't have a strong economy without investment, and government must play its role in not only investing in the economy itself, but in inducing the private sector to invest. I agree with both of those points. The key and actually essentially crucial problem with the budget is it does neither of these things. If we look at the first table here, bit down the table, all of this is from the OBR, unless I say otherwise, is the real GDP over the next period. The October 2024 expected growth in GDP is 7.1%. That's compared to 7.6% in the March budget by Jeremy Hunt. Now, things are getting worse in terms of growth, not better. And 7.1% over 5 years is effectively about 1.4% a year. That's really poor. That's very meager growth. And crucially, no increase to growth from the budget measure or the overall measures. And that's quite crucial if we um, go backwards and think about how prosperity, public services, public finances are all dependent on strong growth. We're getting weaker growth and no improvement as a result of the budget. And that's not surprising when you turn to the chart, again, all OBR stuff, where it shows that the level of government investment, this is as a proportion of GDP, and the verdict is that government investment remains broadly flat. That's the official verdict from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR. So that is, in effect, the cause of the economic weakness that we're seeing, that there's going to be, despite all the talk beforehand, there's going to be no significant increase at all in government investment. It remains broadly flat. And from those two things, a whole series of difficulties arise. The first is on public finances. Now, I've highlighted here the spending on the NHS because that's a crucial part of public spending, as everyone accepts, I think, and contrasted it with the Blair and Brown years. Now, that wasn't without its own difficulties, but overall, over the lifetime of the Blair-Brown government, annual real spending on the NHS rose by 5.5%. Now, what happened then was that the NHS significantly improved. Waiting lists came down, and there were far fewer backlogs, and that we know from that level of spending improves the NHS, or at least it did then, because the population has both grown and aged since. But then we see where the Tory level of spending on the NHS has got us, which is about 2.8% real growth a year, and that's led us to crisis. Actually, the worst of all was under the coalition, Tory Lib Dem coalition. So that laid the basis for the crisis, and then the crisis itself occurred while spending on the NHS was growing at 2.8% year on year. So that gives us some benchmark or framework for deciding essentially what's austerity and what's not austerity in relation to the NHS, which is only one part of public spending, but very important part. Now, if we cast our eyes over to the second, well, it's the first table on this page, an OBR table showing the total departmental expenditure limit spending is essentially that's all the money that government departments have. And in the presentation of this type of data in the Treasury document, routinely they stop at the year 2025 to 26, and they don't elaborate about what's expected in the following years, 2026 onwards out to the beyond the end of this parliament. And what we actually see, if you look at the real growth rate of the total departmental expenditure limit, what you see is a bit of an uplift in the first years, while the 2024, 25 were already in that, and next year, and then it falls very sharply. Now, the point of this is if that, and that they haven't specified on which departments that will fall, but it's got to, if the total is so weak, it has to fall on departments or another. And as a result, what we see is over the period of the out to 2030 is that the growth in departmental spending is exceptionally weak. First point to say is that 3.9 and 4.3%, which is, which is similar to the overall spending on the NHS. The government says in the first couple of years, spending on the NHS will average 4%. But like the rest of government spending, it falls, or it slows very dramatically in subsequent years. And of course, what that means is for the period as a whole, it never reaches the heights of the Blair-Brown period when the NHS did improve, ever, it never reaches those. And for the period as a whole, it's way below. It's something like an average of 1.8% a year, something like that. That's below where we've been under the Tories for 14 years, or I should say for 10, barring the coalition, that was exceptionally low. But even in the last years, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Theresa May, they all increased public spending at a greater rate, and spending on the NHS at a greater rate than is forecast by the current government. That's austerity. Austerity does not equal cuts. You don't have to have an outright cut in something for it to be austerity. You just have to starve it of the necessary resources for a growing and aging population and the inflation that comes with in the natural course of events. Um, this will mean, in effect, sharp cuts to services. It can mean nothing else. It's even below the rate of inflation that's projected over the period. So there's no question that in terms of government departmental spending, this is austerity. Secondly, is the issue of tax. Now, we've heard a huge hue and cry about the imposition of employers' national insurance contributions. Personally, I don't have a problem with it. Um, I think that businesses benefit from all the types of investment the government makes, whether it's in transport, in health, in education, and so on, and pays too little for it. So I think asking businesses to pay a bit more is appropriate. I think that there's a problem with the overall balance in terms of national insurance because if you remember, which is happening in this year, but this year alone, the cut to employees' national insurance by Jeremy Hunt tends to favour at least people on above average incomes and the well off. They're the big beneficiaries of that. This government has decided not to change that, not to reverse that big cut, which favoured better off and higher income earners, but it has instead plugged the gap by raising national insurance contributions for employers. And so you see over the period, as a percent of GDP, the contribution from national insurance goes from 6.6% down to 5.9% because of Jeremy Hunt's measures, and then back up again, essentially to the same level it was because of the government's measure to apply higher rates of national insurance to employers. But look at the line above, because that's a much bigger change, and that's income tax, and that's paid by ordinary workers. And freezing the income tax thresholds is how that's being done. And that's normally called a stealth tax because people don't see it directly. But what it means is, as people get or fight for higher pay, much more of it will fall into higher tax brackets. That's a direct assault on the incomes of ordinary people. And what's more important in terms of the relative weights of these, the change in the employer's national insurance goes from 5.9% of GDP to 6.6 over the period. That's a rise of 0.7% of GDP. For income tax and freezing the thresholds, that goes from 10.2% to, at the end of the period, 11.5%. That's 1.3% of GDP, i.e., that's effectively double the hit to employers from the rise in national insurance. But we haven't heard anything about that. And there's undoubtedly austerity. That's a cut in the take-home pay of ordinary people. And it's double in size of the hit to employers from paying national insurance. And we've heard nothing about that at all. So we've already seen how there's austerity for departmental spending. Now we can see there's actually austerity in terms of taxation. Then the other big arm of government spending is on welfare. Now, we can argue, and the government argues, that all these different measures don't really add up to a very large change in the outlays on welfare, and outlays on welfare will continue to rise. But that's an argument for not doing them. That's not an argument for doing them. So all these different things, extending case reviews, 3,000 additional staff to tackle almost non-existent DWP fraud, which is a tiny fraction of tax fraud. People being asked to jump through hoops in having to make re-declarations of their circumstances for universal credit. The DWP increasing its debt recovery powers, which means snooping on the bank accounts of poor people. And of course, we've already seen the cut to winter fuel payments. Um, at an annual peak, these reach 3 billion, which in the grand scheme of public spending altogether is not enormous. I would say it's exactly equivalent to the pledge for the Ukraine war. So that's priorities. Uh, you can't have decent welfare, and welfare as relative to pay has fallen dramatically over decades. You can't have decent welfare, but you can have war, and that's the choice that's been made. That's austerity for anyone who's needs to rely on welfare. And then finally, how we can see overall these things are fitting together. There's a 10.3% rise in the defense budget, which is one of the bigger rises. As I've mentioned, 3 billion a year for Ukraine at the same time as was welfare cuts. And there's nothing to tackle widening inequalities except, which is very welcome, a plan to address some of the inequalities as they apply to women in terms of access to jobs and in equal pay. That's very welcome, but there's nothing at all on the same front for Black and Asian workers who suffer in a different way, but to the same extent as women in the workforce. And finally, there's no published equalities impact assessment, which is a statutory duty. And when the last government started to do this, we knew it was because they had assessed that any equalities impact assessment would show that it was the burden of austerity was falling more on women, on Black people, on Asian people. The government hasn't explained why they've done this, and we could leading us to draw our own conclusions. So just finally, I want to say that uh, a proper analysis of the budget, and if we're not taken in by the government's presentation of the first couple of years of the budget, one of which in any case was the year in which the Tories were hoping to get re-elected, so they loosened the purse strings. But if we look out over the period, it's undoubtedly there's the case that there's very severe tightening of the belt in relation to departmental spending, which amounts to austerity. There's the freezing of the income tax thresholds, which is an imposition on ordinary workers. There's cuts to welfare, and yet there's money for war. This is an austerity budget, I'm afraid to say.